really a wonderful honor for me to be here. I haven't been to Tampa since the mid-90s. I went to a conference at the University of South Florida. ¿Te acuerdas? And before that, when I was going to school at the University of Florida, I was here in the 70s and 80s, if you can believe that. Remember my first visit to the e-board factory. At the time it was closed, but there were those famous stairs that Martí stood on with the factory workers. And so for me, that's coming to Tampa is always this. It's always this reliving of this history. So I'm really happy to be here with you all and to talk about my most recent book is sort of a pulling together of the research that I've done on Key West for years and years. So it was a labor of love, and I'm not sure what else I can say about Key West, so I'm going to have to move on, right? Talk about other things, maybe Tampa. But anyway, today what I want to talk about is the origins and development and endurance of the Key West revolutionary community. Tampa, of course, emerges from that community. And it's a very interesting story about how Tampa emerges, because it emerges in its own way. It's a very different story. But it brings many of those same traditions. So to understand Tampa, I think you have to understand Key West. So I'm going to try to give you a bit of understanding about that story as we go through. This is a wonderful sort of bird's eye view map of Key West that I found at the Library of Congress. And I just love it. It gives you a really good sense of a bustling little but very isolated place. And it also gives you a sense of how a Cuban community could be so powerfully Cuban for so long, simply because it's an island at the very tip of Florida with nothing else very close by. So there was very little temptation to become Americanized, if you will. The Cubans were always looking south. They were never looking north, unlike today, of course. All the Cubans are looking north. This to some extent geographically helps us understand the powerful Cuban identity that existed and endured in Cuba. Let me see if I can. I'm going to be walking back and forth because I don't have a little clicker. The story begins, of course, with El Grito de Yara. It begins with the Cuban independence movement. There is a big story before that, which I won't get into. The Cuban movement begins in the 1820s. It goes through the 40s and 50s. There are communities in the United States long before they arrived in Key West. But the Key West story begins with the outbreak of the War of Independence on October 10, 1868, when Carlos Manuel de Céspedes declared independence, freed his slaves, and began a process that would take 30 years to complete. Not in the way that Cubans expected, but nevertheless, it came to an end, that is, the Independence War. So Céspedes is one of the icons of Key West all the way through the 30 years. He was the man that sort of represented what they were doing and why they were doing it. So just wanted to give you an image of that sort of patriotic stance. Here you see him declaring independence and freeing his slaves, which he did. Now, when I started doing my research originally, I began with sort of the conventional history, in which Key West was one of many communities in exile. But the thing about communities is that whether we see them or not, they're all very unique. They all have their very specific ways. And so Key West had its way, New York had its way, Tampa later has its way of being. And the thing about Key West at first that nobody really recognized in the early historiography, the early writings about Key West, is that it was a very radical community. Probably, as we'll see as we go through this, the most radical of all of the communities, for a variety of reasons that we'll explore. And that radical ideal involved maintaining an identity, a very powerful sense of being Cuban, a distinct multiracial people with a unique culture. This is how they viewed what Cuba was all about. They wanted Cuba to be absolutely independent. They didn't want it to be a colony of Spain. They didn't want it to be annexed to the United States. They wanted it to be an absolute independent country because there were a lot of forces, political forces at work that wanted either reform and autonomy or annexation to the United States. And Cubans rejected both of those. And thirdly, they wanted Cuba to be revolutionary. And in this sense, what I mean by revolutionary in this sense is committed to armed action. That is, Key West was always committed to armed action. They didn't want to just be there to propagandize or to theorize, but they wanted to always be in action, regardless of the cost. And so these are the three issues that are very central to the Key West story. So, broken up the talk into 6 different sections. First of all, issue of cigars. Cigars, I know that you have already had a presentation on cigar culture. I'm not going to get into that today, but to talk about the importance of the cigar industry in establishing Key West as an exile community. Secondly, the forging of an enduring revolutionary community. One thing is to establish a community that has a particular task for the short term. And it's something else to have a community that establishes itself for the longer term. So in Key West, from the very beginning, it was committed to the long term, whatever it took to get to the goal, which is very much in the exile idea. If you look at Miami has had that same kind of thing, where Cubans have this exile identity and they just can't get beyond it. Key West was a lot like that. And then, evolving revolutionary strategies. They had to sort of reinvent themselves over the 30-year period in terms of how to think about getting the Spanish out of Cuba. And we'll go over that. Finally, preserving the revolutionary community. There were points in the history of Key West when there were these threats to this radical notion of radical revolution, of nationalist revolution. So we'll talk about that. And then talk about José Martí in Key West, rethinking the relationship. There's always been this conventional thinking about José Martí and his relationship to Key West, which over time I began to sort of question, to offer a more complex understanding of the relationship between Martí and Key West. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, trying to go to the big picture, if you will, at the end, Cuban nationalism and U.S. imperialism. Key West is this is a micro story. One of the reviews of my book said that I like the book, but I've never seen a book with so many names in it. And I've always done that. I've always put people's names, lots of names. And it's because somehow I feel like they deserve to be named. All these people, I might not say anything about them, but their name is there. And so I've always been partial to that, and I'm always criticized for that. Who wants to hear all these names and not know anything about them? It doesn't matter. So it's a micro history, but in the end, you have to tie that micro history to some bigger, to a kind of a bigger picture. So I'm going to just a few reflections at the end about how this story, Cuban nationalism and U.S. imperialism during this era, emerging imperialism during this era, is related. Then, at the end of each section, I'm going to stop for questions, discussion. You're free to ask questions throughout anytime you want, but I'm going to formally stop in each section and say, well, what do you think? If you have any particular questions, maybe some additional background information because you're not familiar with sort of the context of what I'm saying. So feel free to engage me along the way. This is always more fun as a conversation than as a lecture.
Just use the down arrow.
Excuse me?
Use the down arrow. You don't have to worry about cursing.
The down arrow?
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
It should work. There you go.
Technology. I have a guru. Thank you. All right, so first thing to know is that before the Cubans arrived here, Key West is really an fishing village, which the Cubans later in the century always reminded the Anglo-Americans, the original settlers. Don't criticize us so much because before we came, you were just a little fishing village. Now we're a great cigar power. The Cubans were a little, Cubans sometimes do it. So the cigar industry was the economic engine, and it emerges for two reasons. One, because of the war itself. The war breaks out in October 1868, and you have people leaving Cuba in large numbers. And one of the places you could get away too quickly was Key West. So many of the exiles who were on the run landed in Key West. They went to New York, they went to other places, they went to Paris, they went to London, but some of them landed in Key West. And about the same time, we also have the arrival of a couple of cigar entrepreneurs. Because many of those people who are leaving are cigar workers. And there's a sort of opportunity, if you will. But most people who came were not cigar entrepreneurs. They were Cubans who set up little small shops. Some of them were cigar workers themselves and started small chinchillas, storefronts. Others were some middle-class sorts who saw the opportunity and learned the trade and began to, as they set up these little shops, workers in Cuba who were under assault as well for different other reasons were coming to Key West. And so all of this came together. It came together with a bit of entrepreneurship, some workers, in some cases some capital. Ivor, for example, who ended up establishing Ivor City. He is really the only real formed, but the two, Ivor and Siedenberg. These are two capitalists with money who were able to establish the biggest factories in Key West early, 1869, 1870, 1871. The rest were all small shops run by some Spaniards, but mostly Cubans, and some Anglo-Americans as well. And they slowly began to build this industry. And as they did that, they built, they began to produce wealth, which of course is what you need to create a community. Oops. So you can see up there on the right, in 1875, this is 5 years, 35 years after the establishment, beginnings of the industry, you have Ibor, who is pretty much the largest, along with Siedenberg, the two largest ones. And these are folks with capital, who were already entrepreneurs, knew what they were doing, set up shop. And then you have all these other people who slowly but surely begin to organize. De la Rosa, Torano, André, Bello, Prieto, Morales. These are all Cubans or Spaniards, mostly Cubans, Severo de Armas, Anastasio Reyes. And they begin to form these small shops, and it begins to develop so that by late 1880s, Key West is the sort of center of cigar production, as Tampa itself is getting started. The city grew quite rapidly from around 6,000 in 1870 to about 20,000 in 1870 and 1890. Sorry about that. The premier Cuban manufacturer was Eduardo Gato. Gato, who, of course, if you know Martí's work in the 90s, he's critical in terms of funding Martí at certain points. But he arrived in New York in 1869, prepared to join an expedition and to go fight in Cuba. That never happened. He opened up a small shop in New York, a cigar shop, and then finally moved to Key West and established his factory there. And he became sort of the iconic figure, Cuban manufacturer of Key West. And when everybody left Key West in the 80s, late 80s, starting in the 80s, all the big ones, Evo and lots of others, and even Siedenberg later on, Gato was really the largest manufacturer that stays. And he stays for two reasons. One, everybody else was leaving, so that was less competition for him. So he saw that. But also because he was committed to the revolutionary movement. And he knew that if he left, along with all the others, Key West was going to sort of, if all the Cubans left, if all manufacturers left, Key West was going to disappear as a revolutionary center. And so I think he stayed for economic reasons, but also for political reasons. And this is an image of his cigar factory, probably in the 1880s. And this is one of his labels. See, kind of exaggerated a little bit. That's what labels are for. And he even put himself on a label up there. He got the label. In about 1977, I was in a small antique shop in Ocala, and I came across a original Gato box, which I have. It's one of my prized possessions, which I'm trying to figure out who I'm going to give it to, because if I give it to my grandchildren, they're going to start putting pens and things in it, right? So I need to find a good museum where I can leave it, but it's a great find. And everybody I got it for about $5, and I was jumping around like this, and everybody's looking at me, what's the matter with that man? But what the cigar industry did, besides create wealth and resources to promote the revolutionary community, it created a broader community. I mean, the cigar industry was at the heart, and most of the workers most of the people were workers in the factories. But it also gave rise to a normal community with all kinds of other things. So it supported the cigar industry, supported the undertakers, and it supported the streetcars, and it supported the bakers. This is the streetcar that Gato founded in Key West. And so you look at the census, and of course, Key West has all the things that you would expect in any community. And so so it was an engine. The cigar industry was an engine to create a community, and then the community created a revolutionary force. And so what we want to look at is how that happens. So my first pause. Any questions? Any clarifications on this part? Yes?
When the Cuban cigar makers were establishing themselves in Key West, did they have to get licenses or permits from the U.S. government? Was it that isolated from the rest of Florida and the U.S. that they could just go and kind of settle without having to negotiate?
Well, there wasn't, they're not as regulated back then as they are today. So people could come and they could set up, and they'd have to pay their whatever taxes they had to pay. But yeah, I mean, it was pretty open. So people could go. I don't know that we have very much information on sort of the mechanics of how Ybor, for example, shows up in Key West, or how Siedenberg was actually in New York before he goes to Key West. But Ybor was, from all accounts, in Havana, and all kinds of speculations as to why he left, we don't really know. But he ends up in Key West, and these two guys just show up, set up their factories, they have capital, but exactly all of the sort of paperwork that they might have had to go through, we don't have much information on that. Glenn Westphal, he wrote the first biography of Ybor. He doesn't get into that. He never found much information about that. And then the rest of them were just small entrepreneurs that just began to sort of form and develop, and I don't think they really were required to get permits or anything. Yes?
We've been reading that one incentive for the manufacturers to come from Cuba to Key West is that the U.S. imposed heavy tariffs on made cigars, but not on tobacco. What's the reason to not just impose a heavy tariff on tobacco too? Why would the U.S. differentiate that way?
Because they wanted to encourage the U.S. domestic production. So they could get the leaf free, right? And that was an incentive to bring the leaf here and produce the cigars here rather than Havana, right? So that was the idea. The cigar, and this of course was at the heart of how this grows up in Key West. Is that if you can make a Cuban cigar in Key West and not have to pay the tariffs, that's the best of all worlds. So you have a Cuban cigar manufacturer or Spanish, you've got Cuban workers, you've got Cuban leaf. That's a Cuban cigar, right? And you produce it in Key West, and then you sell it to your market in the United States, and you can beat the price that they production out of Cuba itself.
So not to be super dim about this, but I'm not a cigar smoker, so like why wouldn't the U.S. want to protect tobacco farms in the U.S.?
Because it wasn't as good.
It's just not as good, and people don't like the taste.
Well, you had the Virginia, North Carolina tobacco. Yeah, the Cubans had always had either better tobacco or better marketing. Right?
The soil conditions are different, the climate is different.
My brother is from the Dominican Republic, or lives in the Dominican Republic.
Yeah.
He claims that the Cubans, the only reason Cuban tobacco is better than Dominican tobacco is because the Cubans have a better marketing outfit.
Yeah.
I don't believe it myself. But yeah, yes.
How significant was Afro-Cuban entrepreneurship in this community? So it's a multiracial community, but are they also participating in the growth of small businesses and small cigar shops?
That's a very good question. I've not found a great deal of evidence of Afro-Cuban entrepreneurs, store owners, that sort of thing. They were heavily represented in the cigar the cigar makers.
And there were a few prominent newspaper writers.
And they were newspaper people, and they were the revolutionary ranks. But it's not always easy to know what race these folks are. When you go and see these lists, for example, that I showed you, it doesn't mention race, so it's hard to know. But we do know that there were prominent Afro-Cubans in other kinds of jobs, factories. I haven't run across any information on that. Excuse me? Yeah. Yes.
I can't help but keep thinking about these isolated communities of refugees and exiles as palenques, you know, where they, especially when they maintain a separate identity that doesn't jive with the community of origin.
Right.
But I also wonder.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Yes, like a palenque, because
Oh,
of the
yeah.
ties.
Like a palenque.
But it's an analogy.
Cimarron.
But more broadly, how many of the refugees or exiles belong to the category that was always contentious in both wars, the 60s and the 90s, which were the pacificos, the people who just wanted to get on with their lives and carry on with their business? Were they all politically motivated, or was there a community of people who just wanted to make money?
We'll cover some of that as we go through. The answer is it was more complicated than they're all been a completely unified community, but that will be part of the story as we go forward. Good question.
Going back to the question, I'm thinking that if in 1868 is when the immigration started, most of the Afro-Cubans or the black Cubans, they were even just free from slavery, or the ones who were free, they didn't have the same economic opportunity or the same social mobility to be able to be entrepreneurs. Because it was, it's Cuba does not end slavery until 1886.
Yes.
So they definitely didn't have the same opportunities in order to be entrepreneurs.
But it's also
that's what I did. It was not the same conditions that the criollo had in order to be entrepreneurs. So that's something that I was thinking that, it's definitely they were not in the same position in order to be able to be entrepreneurs.
But it is true that Cuba had a lot of free.
Yes, they have
free blacks.
free
who
blacks
were. Yeah. So it wouldn't surprise me to know that some of these folks were Afro-Cubans. Just that we don't know. We don't have the. I don't have the. One way you can find out, which I've never done, is to go through the census data. And compare it. And compare it to the names on these kinds of lists. But I've never done
That's
that.
the legacy.
Yes.
You sort of hinted at it with the jiving back at the Americans that this was just a fishing village. But what's the reaction of the local Anglo community to this? Because in Tampa they get a welcome, Ewart gets a welcome sort of space from this. But I'm curious. They seem the Anglo community seems to have its own racket going in Key West. What do they think?
It's mixed. It's mixed. That is the Anglo community is not happy with this flood of Cubans coming in. And they express that pretty clearly in Florida newspapers, express that kind of thing all the time. But on the other hand, they were producing a lot of money for them, right? They was producing a lot of wealth.
They like the Eagles, but they didn't like Eagles.
Yeah, so it was a kind of a complex relationship, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward as well. Yes?
Jerry, in our previous discussions about Ybor, it was mentioned that Ybor City was immune from Jim Crow laws for the most part. Did Jim Crow reach Key West?
Jim Crow reached Key West in some ways, not in terms of formally segregating at least Cuban blacks from their own community. This it begins to happen after that in Key West as well. But during this time, Jim Crow reflects itself more in attitudes about not just black people, but Cuban people.
Yeah, racial people.
Yeah, and that sort of thing. So we'll talk also, a lot of this stuff will come up as we go forward. Yes?
Were most of the people that were leaving Cuba at the time, were they leaving for, were they political exiles, or were they people that were directly coming to work in the cigar?
Well, really the first people were political exiles. I mean, these were folks who had to get out of town.
That were being picked out by the Spaniards?
They weren't being kicked out. They were leaving because if they got captured, it wouldn't have been good for them. They were, at this time in Havana, when the war first broke out, 1869, 70, they were gathering up people, anybody that they thought that was sympathetic to the insurrection, were being deported. They were being deported to Spain or to Africa, North Africa.
But not to Cuba?
No, they weren't being, no. They weren't being deported.
Because in Cuban history, I remember as a kid studying Cuban history in Cuba, they put a lot of emphasis on the fact that most of the people that were leaving the island were going into el destierro, being kicked out by the Spaniards.
Well, there's no.
Like José Martí was.
But there were two things going on. One is either you were captured or found out or arrested, and you were deported, in which case you were going either to Spain, like Martí got off light by being deported to Spain,
Right.
and also because he was a young kid. Or if you were an adult, you could go to Fernando Po, which was in Africa. Excuse me?
And
Ceuta. And people who went there often, they just died there. But many of those people escaped those places and they would go up, they would end up in New York. So a lot of those deported folks, and I've never learned too much about how they could escape, but many of them did. And then they would end up over in New York.
Juan Alberto Gomez was deported to Ceuta,
Yeah,
and then eventually got back to Cuba.
that's right. So, but the ones who were coming to the United States, they were it's called self-deported. You heard that term? They were exiled. They exiled themselves. They went to Key West. They went to New York. They went to New Orleans. They went to Charleston. They went to lots of different places. Yeah.
Asylum seekers.
That's right. Yes.
Does Spain have the diplomatic muscle to police these people that are leaving? In other words, are there consuls established in these communities, spies? Is Spain any strong in pursuing this?
Oh yes, Spain was absolutely very strong in this. They had a consulate in Key West. In fact, most of my information in my book about sort of the inner workings of the Cuban community comes from the consuls. I went to Spain and I found all the consular reports. The Spaniards were great bureaucrats. Consulates in Key West, consulates throughout the country, but for the purposes of Key West, I have found the consular papers from the establishment of the consul all the way to the breaking of relations. And one of the main activities of the consul was to watch the Cubans and to report on the Cubans. So much of the information I have comes from the consular reports, which is really interesting. So yes, they were on it all the time. In fact, they used to warn the Spanish government, don't worry about those folks in New York. They're not a threat to us. They can talk all they want, they can write all they want. The threat is in Key West. They're raising money, they're buying guns, they're sending expeditions. And so that was it. Well, let me move on. Okay.
You have a hand mark.
Oh, I didn't see that.
I didn't know if you noticed what you did.
Thank you. Okay, so the second piece is about the creation of a revolutionary community. How did they do this? And there are three things. One is identity, keeping a sense of who you are, and insisting on maintaining that across generations. That's the key, across generations. Because if the next generation doesn't care, then the community disappears. So you had to find a way to ensure that identity is being taken across generations. Nationalism, you had to keep that ideal burning, not only in the exile generation, but in the children and even the grandchildren. And third, mobilization. You had to keep the community mobilized, permanent mobilization. And that was the key. So these are the three issues, the three main issues that, let's see if I can do this. That one over here. All right. So in terms of politics, as I mentioned earlier, the goal was absolute independence in Key West always. If you went to New Orleans or you went to New York, those communities had people who were reformists. They had people who were annexationists. And they were always like that. They were diverse. These were diverse communities. Key West was never a place that tolerated anything but absolute independence. That didn't mean that there weren't some people there who had these other ideas, but they were, whenever those ideas came out, they were attacked fiercely by the local press. And sometimes even run out of Key West. There were two folks, for example. One was Antonio Zambrana, who was a very important a very important revolutionary leader in Cuba during the war. And in the late 1880s, the first war ends, and many Cubans go back, including Zambrana, and he becomes an autonomist. And in Key West, he is attacked fiercely, despite his history of being this independence figure, an important independence figure. In the 80s, he is attacked fiercely out of Key West because he had decided that the only solution was autonomy of some kind. They could never beat Spain. Okay, so and the other is Juan Bello de Luna, who was also a very fierce pro-independence guy in New York in the 1870s. He published a newspaper throughout the 1870s in New York called La Independencia. He was a pretty staunch supporter of independence. In the 1880s, he becomes an annexationist. One of the two most important annexationist voices in New York in the late 1880s. And he too is fiercely attacked in Key West. So there was never any room for anything besides absolute independence.
Annexation towards Spain.
No, United States. I'm sorry. Yeah. Autonomy or reform with regard to Spain. That is that they wanted Cuba to be a province of Spain, right? Not a colony of Spain. And annexationists wanted to reject Spain altogether and wanted to become part of the United States.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. As a matter of fact, the annexationists in the 1850s argued, with support of the southern slaveholders, argued that Cuba could become 3 states. Right? And the idea there, of course, is to have 3 more slave states. This is in the 1850s. So they were, in the 1880s, the annexationists were not the slaveholders anymore because they didn't exist, but they were the American capitalists who wanted Cuba to be simply part of the United States for economic reasons. So, politics, absolute independence. The second thing was leadership. You had to have a strong leadership that were willing and available just to continue the work of moving this along. And there were 3 really, throughout this period, there were 3 really central figures in terms of politics. There were many others, but these were the ones that were recognized by the Cuban community itself as the 3 principal leaders during this 30-year period. José Francisco de Madrid, who was a leader in New York during the 1870s, and when the war ended, he he moved to Key West because he saw that Key West was ready to continue the fight, where New York was kind of withdrawn. And he was an attorney that lived in New York, so he's of the oldest generation. And then José Martí, who was an exile into Key West in 1869. He was one of the first organizers of that community in 1869, moving forward. And he was from Havana, and he had been a laborante, that is an underground worker for the insurrection in Havana, and he was found out, and he left, and he went to Key West. He had to get out quick, got on a fishing boat, went to Key West, and there he remained. And Fernando Figueredo, who was actually a fighter in Cuba during the 10 Years' War. He was an aide to President Cespedes. Later, he was with Maceo. And eventually, he goes to the Dominican Republic after the end of the war, and then later to Key West. And each represent different things. Figueredo represents the veterans who had fought in Cuba. La Madrid represents the old tradition, the link to the past, the link to the whole insurrectionary independence of the past. And Poyo represented a local leader, a local revolutionary leader.
Fernando Figueredo had been studying engineering at Troy, New York, and got very involved with the Cuban community. As a student at Troy, he became a member of the Masonic temple called La Universal, which became a very important Masonic center. His uncle is important for the class to know. His uncle was Perucho Figueredo, who is the Francis Scott Key of Cuba, because he's the one that writes the La Bayamesa, the Cuban national anthem. They arrest his uncle. They may have already executed his uncle in Santiago de Cuba when he receives word at Troy and leaves, comes to Oriente, and because he was so well educated in engineering, he becomes the right hand of Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, and because he spoke English perfect.
Exactly right. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. And then, of course, Figueredo then comes to Tampa, and is a very important figure here as well. I'm sure you'll hear more about him as the story is.
And I'll talk about him
Yeah.
on Monday, because he is the first, if I'm not mistaken, he is the first Cuban American to be elected to the Florida House of Representatives, representing Key West, comes back to Key West, becomes superintendent of schools in Key West.
Right, absolutely. So leadership. Revolutionary press is critical. Key West was an important center of publishing. Not newspapers that circulated outside of Key West very much, but within Key West there was always a number of newspapers being published, and these newspapers almost inevitably were there to promote the war. So every single day, as people picked up their local newspapers, there was this sort of drumbeat about independence, and it's really important. This is the first newspaper that's published. It begins publication in 1869, and the editors were José María Reyes, who had worked for El Siglo in Havana, and José Poyo, who had actually worked for La Gaceta de La Habana before he was exiled. And so these two men meet, and maybe they knew each other in Cuba, I don't know, but they meet in Key West, and they immediately found this newspaper. And it is sort of the voice of this emerging revolutionary community. Later on, there's a couple other newspapers in between. Then you have in 1878, in Yara, which Poyo founds. And this newspaper actually was the longest lived Cuban nationalist newspaper of the 19th century. This was published from 1878 to 1890, 20 years, nonstop. And then when he returned to Cuba in 99, he tried to publish it in Cuba, but by then this sort of fervent nationalism had to give way because of U.S. occupation. It wasn't going to thrive in Havana at that time. So that newspaper dies in Havana in 1899. What's that play? Was a short-lived newspaper, but it's important because it was founded by Fernando Figueredo, and it was a very fervent nationalist newspaper as well, and radical, calling for immediate resumption of war. And the other one is La Propaganda, which was published through most of the 80s by another veteran. Estrada was a colonel in the war in Cuba, and I'm pretty sure that he was Afro-Cuban. I've not seen anywhere that it says it outright, but he's referred to as a negro often by the Spanish consul, who didn't like him very much. And many of his associates were Afro-Cubans. So I'm thinking that he was Afro-Cuban. Excuse me? Oh, yeah. So there's these four, and there are others that I'll make reference to as we go along. But these newspapers were there always, and were very important for keeping up the whole discourse of revolution and independence.
Estrada's paper is what? I can't make out.
La Propaganda. La Propaganda.
La Propaganda.
Yeah. These newspapers, by the way, I didn't even know La Propaganda existed until I went to, I found all these newspapers in Spain. These consuls did us a great job as they were spying. They sent the newspapers to Spain. They said, look at these Cubans, these crazy Cubans, look what they're doing. And they just folded up these newspapers and put them in their little files, and there they were. So I was able to get them digitized. If anybody's interested in these newspapers, I can certainly make them available. Yes?
Jerry, would these be papers that were read by lectores or read directly by citizens, both?
Yeah, they were sold locally, distributed. El Yara was actually, was really the most prominent, and it was the most distributed. This one was smuggled into Cuba on a regular basis, and it was read in all the other communities as well. And it was exclusively, it really was exclusively focused on issues of independence. Although it gets more complicated as we go on. Yes? The readers. So you have leadership, you have newspapers, you've got the readers. So how do these people who are coming from Cuba, these workers, who are not necessarily leaving for any political reasons, they're coming to work. Many of them Spanish. And so how is it that they become such a constituency for this very radical notion about Cuba? Besides the newspapers, then, we've got the readers, because it turns out that the readers were the newspaper guys. the important readers, the two important readers in the 1870s was José María Reyes, who worked in the Wolf factory, I think, and then later worked in the Siedenberg factory, the largest factory. Poyo was the reader in the Ybor factory, all the way through the 70s, all the way until Ybor moves here. In fact, Poyo comes with him to work, to read in the factories here for a period of time. And then later on in the century, José María González is really one of the most important readers in the Gato factory. And you can, these guys, you already heard about the readers, so you know what the idea was for the readers. But what these guys did is they turned the institution of reading into a political act, into a revolutionary act. And so they would read besides the educational material, the novels, and all those kinds of things, they were reading all this political propaganda that's being published in Key West, but also from newspapers in New York. The readers are the ones who introduced Martí to the people in Key West in 1880. I have evidence that Martí's first major speech in New York was published as a pamphlet and was read in Key West as early as 1880. So there's this constant reading that is going on in all the factories. The smaller factories also have readers. And they would simply reinforce this whole notion of independence, and they essentially propagandized these workers. And these workers came into an environment in which this is what they were hearing all the time. Their consciousness was raised about the issue of Cuban independence. So that is how these workers then become such supporters. That's not to say that every worker necessarily supported it, and we'll see as we move forward that not every worker did. And there were times when most workers, there was a time when lots of the workers were rejecting it outright for other reasons that we'll talk about. But this is the essential piece of the puzzle, is keeping this constant issue in the air. And this is one of the earliest known sketches of a lector, probably not in Key West, actually it's in New York, and 1873. And then this is a later picture after the century. We don't really have any good photographs that I've seen of any readers in Key West in the 19th century. Political clubs. Political clubs. As you all know, immigrant communities always create their own organizations. The first thing they do often is create mutual aid societies in order to help each other, to come together. And in Key West, they did that. And one of the first ones they created was the San Carlos, which I'll talk about. And it was a bit of a mutual aid society. It was a social center. It was a school. But it was also a political center. And those things all came tied together. And so the political clubs did the same thing as the press, did the same thing as the readers. And it was in these places where people were actually mobilized. If you needed to get them actually doing something, protesting, demonstrating, the political clubs was the vehicle for doing that. So already in 1869, you have the Asociación Patriótica de Carrihueso, and that was formed locally. Then you have the Asociación del Sur, which was actually founded by Francisco Aguilera, the vice president of Cuba, who visited Key West and said, we need to get you guys all unified because there were a lot of clubs. Organized this one in 1871. After the end of the 10 Years' War, they immediately established a new club in 1878. And it was very organized along Masonic principles. And then you have this other club in 1884 in Centro Revolucionario, which is this.
This is
a flyer I found again in the Spanish archives, in which it outlines what this club is going to do. And one of the things it does is creates a tradition which we'll see later in the Cuban Revolutionary Party, which is the idea is that you create this center, and every member of this center was charged with going out in the community and forming another club. And so the idea was to organize the entire community. And this would be this main center, and then all the other clubs would form, and they would have an association of clubs. And the Partido Revolucionario was like that, except that in the case of the Partido Revolucionario, the clubs already existed, and then formed the Partido. Here, the idea was you organize this, and then you go out and you organize the clubs. But this was the idea that persisted in Key West. And so always in Key West, you had all of these clubs, sometimes operating together, sometimes more not so unified. But nevertheless, the idea of the heart of the community, these political clubs, where you could mobilize people for revolution. At the grassroots, you had women. Earlier, I was talking to somebody. What's your name?
Danny.
About the women and their role of the women. And in the early years, women didn't really work. There weren't that very many women who actually worked in the factories. As time goes on, more and more women joined the factories. But because the women didn't work in the factories, and most of them stayed at home, they had time on their hand to organize. And so they were the ones that went house to house often. They created, they had bazaars, they had patriotic events. Whenever you had visiting revolutionaries, they organized everything. They brought the food, they published pamphlets. So they were active and were very important in keeping the spirit going and getting people mobilized. But more importantly, they were also the ones raising the children. And they were the ones socializing their children about revolution, about Cuba, about independence. And these women were as vociferous as the men in this camp. So the women were always at the grassroots. They were never really given leadership positions in terms of the sort of main clubs. But they had their own clubs. As time went on, they formed their own clubs. And here are two examples of, these are probably from the 1890s. I don't have the dates on them. And then you had the psychotic figure, Carolina Rodriguez La Patriota, who was a grand orator in Key West. Later she comes to Tampa. But she, whenever there was an event, she was one of the featured speakers all the time. So women did a really important work in getting this mobilization going whenever it was needed, which was often.
She traveled with Martí up and down Florida up to Martí City and so forth.
Yeah. But she was already a figure in her own right before Martí showed up in Florida. He had already, in the 1880s, she was a known figure in Key West. Schools. Again, going back to the idea that you had to promote this thing across generations, in Key West, you had a variety of schools. You had, in 1870, I think, the public school system begins. But most Cubans are actually sending their children to private schools. And the most important one was San Carlos Institute, which was established in 1871 for a variety of reasons. But the school piece was intended to ensure that the children were raised as Cubans. Again, this is very, you think of Miami. When the Cubans arrived in the 60s and 70s, they sent their children to school, but after school, they would take their children and put them in Cuban schools, the little Cuban schools, where they were taught Spanish, Spanish was reinforced. They were taught Cuban geography, Cuban history, Cuban culture, Cuban music, and this is exactly what these people were doing, much earlier. And the children, my great-grandfather was raised in Cuba, and this man was always Cuban. There was never any doubt that he was Cuban. And when he returned to Cuba, he lived just the rest of his life in Cuba and as a Cuban. Right? So it's really interesting to think of how, and the isolation piece is important here. Because if you don't have much interaction outside to the north, right, then you're looking south. And he was, I mean, he always believed he was going to be back in Cuba at some point. Just the way it was.
Gerald, you need to clarify that the Poyo you showed there is who you just spoke about, right?
That's right. That's right.
That was your grandfather.
Great-grandfather.
Great.
You didn't do that. Yeah.
So this is an image of the institute that was in 1871, and then this is the second building that was built after the famous Key West fire that I'll mention later on. And then this building was destroyed in 1919, and the Cuban government built the next building, which is the building that sits in Key West today. So it's gone through its various iterations, but it's still there. Patriotic celebrations. I don't think the Cubans really spent much time with the 4th of July, but they spend a lot of time with 10 de Octubre and with 27 de Noviembre. And of course, that's Independence Day, October 10th. And the 27th of November was a day when the Spanish government executed medical students for alleged anti-Spanish activities. And this is a particularly important to Key West because they were convicted or accused of defaming or defacing the burial site of a Spanish editor who had traveled to Key West to be involved in a duel with José Reyes. Reyes' newspaper, he claimed that Reyes was pretty harsh in his language towards Cuba and Castañón in particular. And so Castañón felt so offended that he challenged him to a duel and came to Key West. And depending on who you believe, he was either executed or he was just shot. He was shot because he tried to kill somebody else. There's all kinds of different versions. Nonetheless, Castañón was killed in Key West, and as a result of that, these students were eventually arrested and executed in Havana. And so this date becomes very, very important for Key West in particular. And so every year, we would have these celebrations. In 1892, I think it was, yes, the community built dedicated a monument to those Mártires de Cuba on the grave of La Madrid, the guy that I mentioned earlier. And that became the place where the community would gather every October 10th to rally for Cuban independence. And the idea of going to the cemetery every October 10th began in 1869. They did it every single year. So you could see how these things were just embedded in the people's minds. Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and I just told her that one thing that's, I don't know if it's taught in Cuba, I'm not sure, but actually that when these students were going to be executed, that 5 ñañigos, 5 Abacua practitioners tried to defend them, to rescue them from this firing squad. And that's something that only recently has surfaced in Cuba, and not by the official education system. So I think it's very interesting to see how how involved they were also there.
Yes.
And we have to assume that to some degree that was the case here too, although it's something that doesn't get talked about in Tampa.
These were ñañigos in QS.
Huh?
These were ñañigos in QS.
No, Cuban ñañigos in Havana when they were gonna be
They were
shot.
executed in.
Yeah,
Havana,
they were
on the
executed
steps,
they were executed
Oh,
in
I see.
Cuba. Yeah, two people they were
on the steps of the university, and the 5 ñañigos tried to rescue them. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just looking at this monument. So this is the Key West Cemetery, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a similar monument on one of many trips to Cuba. I had a tour of the Colón Cemetery
Yes.
with Mario Coyula Crowley, the great architect. And there is a similar monument dedicated to the fighters, the immigrant fighters of Key West and Tampa
Yes.
in the Colón Cemetery.
Yes.
And I cannot find an image of it because I wanted to insert it in my presentation. But across the road from that monument in Colón Cemetery is the Ybor gravesite,
Oh.
IBOR.
Oh, okay.
And it's abandoned and it looks terrible.
That's most of them are.
It's horrible.
I think what you're referring to is the Pantheon of the Association of Revolutionary Exiles, which was established when all the exiles went back to Cuba at the beginning of the 20th century. They eventually formed a group which became quite prominent, and they created this Pantheon in 1918.
Okay.
And I think that's where my great-great-grandfather was buried as well, in that Pantheon, for revolutionary exiles. So I think that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, it has that tall, like, obelisk or whatever you call that.
Another piece is Cuban involvement with the Anglo-American community. As we mentioned earlier, there was some mixed relationships because the Cubans were coming in, and already they became so politicized that they also became involved in U.S. politics, that is local politics, and not just Cuban politics. And the incentive there to get involved in U.S. politics were two. One was to promote their own local ethnic issues per se in the city, but also to ensure that the Key West community, Anglo-American community, would maintain support for what the Cubans' ultimate goal was, which was independence. The Cubans were involved in sending arms and expeditions to Cuba, which was of course against the law, and they needed the Anglo-Americans to kind of turn a blind eye to this and allow them to do their work without complications. And one way they could do that was by being involved in who got elected, and who got elected in local politics. And so the Cubans were a very, very important voting bloc in U.S. politics beginning as early as 1876, when they elected Carlos Manuel de Céspedes y Céspedes mayor of Key West. So you can imagine this guy shows up. I think he showed up in Key West in 1873 after his father was killed. His father was the fellow at the beginning who was the declared independence. This was his son who left Cuba when his father was killed, went to Key West, and then 2 years later, he's elected mayor of Key West. So that means that the Cubans were very mobilized, and he's elected mayor of Key West as a Republican. So it wasn't just as a Cuban, but as a Republican. And so he got the Republican Party sort of behind the Cubans and supporting the Cubans. So it was this mixing of exile politics and domestic politics, which was directed at promoting, in the end, promoting independence. Going back to Fernando Figueredo, he was elected member of the Assembly,
Tallahassee.
Tallahassee.
State of Representatives.
Right. In 1884, I think it was. And then later on, in 1889, the Cubans elected both members to the House, to the Assembly. One guy by the name of Moreno, and the other one was Pompes, who later comes to Key West. And they were also elected, but the Cubans always elected somebody when the Anglo-Americans, they viewed the Anglo-Americans as backsliding somehow. So there's just a message, and you know, we need for you to support us. And so in each case, it was a moment of some kind of alienation of the Anglo community, and this was sort of a reminder, you know, we vote and we can influence things here. So that, yes.
I'm just curious, because Key West is contentious between white and black, and this is the midst of Reconstruction as well,
Yes.
right? So
Yes.
in 1884, there was the independent election. So are they building support within the Key West black community as well? I mean, if he's running as a Republican in 1873, Figueredo, I'm not sure what he runs as.
He runs as a Republican.
So they're dependent a lot on the African American
Yes.
vote.
African American vote and the black Bahamian vote, which was very important for us. There was a white community, a white Bahamian community, which was mostly Democratic Party, and you had a black Bahamian community, which was Republican. So between the black Bahamians, the African Americans, and the Cubans, they could win the elections.
So it's Florida politics in the midst of
Yes.
Reconstruction.
Absolutely. Yeah. As a matter of fact, when the Cubans first arrived and they had to decide who to vote for, they would vote, just like the African Americans, they said we have to vote for the party of Lincoln. And because they would bring abolition to Cuba. Right. Yes.
Figueredo went on, when he moved to West Tampa, he got elected mayor of West Tampa. Then he became superintendent of education in West Tampa like he had been in Key West. And then these two guys that you have up on the screen returned to Cuba. Figueredo becomes the treasurer of the Republic of Cuba. And Carlos Manuel de Céspedes Jr., for a short, I think, few months, became president of Cuba.
Yeah. Well, that's not this guy. This is his older brother.
Oh, it's not this
No,
Carlos Manuel de Céspedes?
No, this is Carlos. That's from his first wife.
Céspedes y
The other one is Céspedes.
Why?
The other one is Céspedes y Quesada. This is Céspedes y Céspedes. Yeah.
So this, he had a half-brother there,
Yeah.
and it's the half-brother that becomes president.
And he was much younger. He was much younger.
Thank you.
Yeah. And he was born in New York, the second.
What do you mean by Cuban Republican newspapers? Were those published in Key West or in Cuba?
No, this is published in Key West, and they were Cuban Republicans. That is, yeah, that's misleading.
Okay, so
The Republican Party. They were supporting the Republican Party, the Key West Republican Party. Yeah.
and who were the editors or the founders of this newspaper?
Cubans. I can't remember their names actually. One is Timon, and the other one was a fellow who he published this, but he was not really a very powerful supporter of revolutionary activism. He was more interested in U.S. politics. So he was kind of trying to say, you know, let's leave Cuba behind. Let's think about politics here, right? And but I have his. If you want his name, I can get it to you. I just don't recall right now.
So there were actually two layers going on here. I mean, these Cubans were united regarding Cuban independence, but divided regarding U.S. politics.
Yes, because you had Cubans, the manufacturers tended to align with the Democratic Party for economic reasons. Cubans, the workers, tended to align with the Republican Party because the Republican Party, interestingly enough, supported labor locally, or supporters of labor at that time. Yes.
Yeah.
And that was because it was a marriage of convenience because the Republicans wanted that vote. In order to get the vote, they had to be open to labor issues. So I'm not sure that held true in other places. baseball. The Cubans even politicized baseball. When the Cubans arrived, they became very aficionados of baseball in Key West and in Tampa. And baseball was actually already a thing in Cuba when the Cubans were coming. So it wasn't an alien game to them. And much of baseball was taken back to Cuba as early as the 1860s of people who came to school, mostly in the north, and then went back to Cuba and took the game with them, and it caught on in Cuba. And so during this whole period, from the 70s and 80s into the 90s, Cubans were playing baseball. It became more politicized in the 80s when the Cubans established their first formal championship. They had 4 teams, and they played on Mondays because they couldn't on Sundays because it was against the law. So they had to play on Mondays. You don't play baseball on Sundays, of course. And so they organized the games, the teams, but of course, after a while, they used it as a way of raising funds. So a certain percentage of the funds that were raised from the games would be given to the revolutionary leaders. This was particularly true in the 90s, when the Cuban Revolutionary Party is created. And every Sunday they would play, every Monday they would play, and they would, the proceeds, a portion of the proceeds would go to the, this is the earliest picture I can find of a Cuban-related team is this one here. This is a team called Cuban Baseball Club, which was established in Havana in 1899. But about half of them were Key West players. Half of them were Key West players. And not a great picture, but that's the best I could do. And the picture above is the baseball team from the USS Maine. Whenever it came into harbor, it would always play against the Cuban team. And every time the Cuban teams beat the Maine team, it would be a great celebration. And this would continue in Cuba later on, right? And of course, all but one of these players was killed in Havana Harbor when the Maine was sunk. Or was sunk, when it sank. It wasn't. Okay, so that's the way that a revolutionary community was maintained over a 30-year period. Established in 1869, all the way until the final War of Independence, and it was a constant effort. Yes.
You have addressed local politics, but I'm curious as to how, at a federal level, as the Cuban community was growing, expanding, not just economically, but also in political power, how did the federal government react? Did they take any, I don't know, concrete measures to address what was going on in the region?
Well, it's also very interesting. The Cubans, just kind of like the Cubans today in Florida, had sort of more power than they probably ought to have, based on their population. It was the same back then. Florida was also very evenly divided, and there was the Republican Democratic parties fought heartily for the Cuban vote in Monroe County, because they could help make the difference in a statewide election. And so the federal government was always cognizant of that. So the Republican Party in Washington was always careful, kind of asking local Republicans, what's going on with the Cubans down there, and so they were cognizant of the politics, which explains why the Cubans were able to do the stuff that they did, with almost without any resistance from the Union. There were moments when there was resistance, but for the most part, the local politicians, especially the people at the ports and everything, just kind of didn't see all these ships leaving and coming with arms, right? And so, until once the war begins, then there's a crackdown. I'll get to that later.
These are non-citizens participating in political elections?
No, at that time, you could vote after being here 6 months.
How times have changed.
Which the Anglo-Americans didn't like, and they were trying to change it, but never got it changed. The Cubans typically came, they would vote, and then they could vote as long as they had a document that expressed their intention to become citizens. You could become a citizen in 5 years, but as long as you had gone down and registered with your intent to become a citizen in 5 years, then you could vote. And so whenever a Cuban arrived, the first thing they do is take him down, get him off the boat, take him over and sign this document of intention to become a citizen, and then they could vote. So it was very useful for the Cubans, for the Cuban community, you would expect. Yes. Yes.
Professor, you'll be interested to know when you talk about politics into the U.S. system, you mentioned Pompez,
Yes.
P-O-M-P-E-Z, that got elected to the House of Representatives. He moves to West Tampa, and he gets elected clerk of our city of West Tampa. Dies prematurely. His son and family stays in West Tampa. The son really loves baseball. Forms his own little club, but they were black Cubans, and they couldn't play against the white team. He moves to New York as a chinchal worker. He forms the New York Cubans. That becomes a very good team.
Hipólito Arenas plays for them.
They finally win, and about 5 years ago, Pompez gets elected to Baseball Hall of Fame.
Yes, I know that story. That's a
A
great
West
story.
Tampa guy, Hipólito Arenas played for the New York Cubans, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for this. This seems like a real Andersonian moment that you're describing here. I couldn't help but think of Benedict Anderson's notion of imagined communities. And although in some ways you're actually complicating and expanding that, because we're having people who are having a sense of nationalism through print capitalism, but across national boundaries, across time and place. I think it's really fascinating. I was wondering if you might be able to comment on that and how you are engaging Anderson or other notions of imagined political communities and the role of capitalism. And then a kind of related question is, do we know what percentage of the immigrants in Key West are literate at the time and are actually consuming the newspapers themselves in their households? Or is the main way that they're getting this information through these like?
Well, we don't have any specific information on literacy, but everybody who's looked at this issue says that the tobacco workers were highly more literate than average working class people because of the lector tradition. That this somehow inspired people to want to learn to read and write. So I think it had that kind of effect. It seems that given all the newspapers that were being published, that these people were certainly could read, right? And one could assume then that they would probably learn how to write. So I think in general we could probably say that it's higher than you would expect for that time period. As far as the as Anderson, I can't say that I spent a lot of time thinking about this relationship, but it's a good one. But this notion of imagined community is very powerful for this community because they create their nation. They create a nation. They create an ideology. They create aspirations, right? They create all kinds of expectations, which will come crashing down when they go to Cuba at the beginning of 1899, 1900, 1901. It's just not what they expect, right? But so I think and there is this interesting relationship between exile and ethnicity. Although the exiles, although these are exiles and they'll go to their grave saying they're Cuban, they can't help but be affected to some extent by the location, by where they are, right? And again, this is kind of like Miami in the 1960s. Hell or high water, we're going back to Cuba, somos Cubanos, right? We're not Cuban Americans, we're not anything, we're Cubans. But of course, after a while, they start acting like something different. Right? You start. So yeah, I think. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for that. I was just wondering if you've come across any women readers or lectors in Key West.
Excuse me, sir?
Any women readers or lectors in Key West?
I'm not. The lectores that I've seen named are all men. I've not seen any reference to women.
I have something.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Good. Yeah, it's something unwavering. Yes.
I have a quick comment.
Yes.
Something related to what he said. My understanding is by the time of independence, Cuba, despite being a colony, had a much higher literacy rate than Spain did.
Oh, yeah.
So, it probably wasn't uncommon for, many Cubans to be able to read and write. I don't know if there was a connection with independence, and the revolutionary movement, but it was.
Could be, yeah, interesting. Yeah, that's something to look into. Thank you for raising that. Did you? Excuse me, did you? Oh, you did.
I have a question about El Cubano.
Yes.
Right? Because it said Cuba and Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
So I was just curious to know, like, outside of Coast, is there any, big Puerto Ricans involved? Because they were clearly writing to not just Cuba, right?
Yeah.
And Puerto Rico is intimately involved in sort of independence, right? So did you come across a lot of names?
There's no sign there were a lot of Puerto Ricans there. There are a few Puerto Ricans. There's a few Mexicans even. But the reason that they labeled it that way is because at that time, the revolutionary junta in New York that was established to fight Spain was called the Junta de Cuba y Puerto Rico. And that's because of Hostos and Betances and all those people who were involved. But that was more a New York thing. And that, after a while, just kind of fades away because this notion of the Confederation of las Antillas, which Betances and Hostos were talking about in the 70s in New York, and writing about it in New York, kind of fades. But it fades, and that sort of discourse kind of goes away. But this is the newspaper in 1870, so they're following that discourse in the U.S.
What can you tell us about the material conditions of the production of all the newspapers in Key West? Like, where were the printing presses located? What was the material culture of the newspaper workers and that kind of thing? Distribution? How much did they charge? This kind of thing.
The newspapers were very primitive. They had hand-cranked, for the most part, presses. Yara, I know that he said Yara did, and it was a family affair with a couple of people from the outside that were helping. His son-in-laws and the daughters and his wife were all involved in the production of the newspaper. So it was a very, very, compared to later on, very primitive kind of thing. They charged originally 5 cents a copy, and then later on it became 10 cents a copy. But from what I can tell is they probably distributed free as many as they sold. And the ones that they sold tended to be outside of Key West, to New York, and other places, and also Key West. But they smuggled them into Cuba, and in Cuba, I don't think they sold very many. I think they were just distributing them. Does that answer your question?
Do you know about the other ones? I mean, you said many. Like, were there newspaper offices as well as?
Yes, there were newspaper offices. They all had their locations. They had offices. But they were, in terms of production, I think they were all produced more or less in the same way. There were no, as far as I can tell, no big presses that you would find in New York or something.
And these are daily?
Most of them begin as weeklies. in later years becomes a daily for a period of time, but it depended on the sort of the enthusiasm of the community for nationalism, which varied over time. It wasn't always totally intense.
To be fair, lots of local newspapers in that period are also just recruits anyway.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Yeah. Yes.
So you mentioned that you found many of your primary sources in Spanish archives,
Yes.
as well as the club, the social club images. What archives are you referring to?
The archives that I've used, the three archives I've used for this material, is the General Administration Archive in Alcalá de Henares. The other one is the National Archive, the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid. And then the third one was the archive of the Ministry of Foreign Relations, which has now been transferred over to the Archivo Nacional, Histórico Nacional. And that's a separate, it's in that archive, but its body of materials is separate. You ask for it under that title. And they all have materials.
What was that last one? The archive
of the Foreign Ministry, Archivo del Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores, I think it was.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had another question sort of in the same vein as Miguel's question about nationalism, specifically the school, the San Carlos that you said was founded in 1871, which is strikes me as really interesting precisely because there wasn't really education within Cuba that was meant to acculturate people as Cuban at this time. My understanding is like a lot of this is pioneered by the Mambises during the 10 Years' War, and so I wonder, is it sort of like a thematic that Kenya works on, the Patria que nace de lejos, right? Is this like do they have a sense of they're doing something exceptional, or like we know a lot about what this instruction was?
It's hard to know. I don't see. I haven't seen much in the newspapers or anything like that refers to this as being particularly exceptional. Nor the goal of it. The goal was to keep identity, to keep nationalism, and that sort of thing. Now, whether they saw it as pioneering in terms of education, it is also the case that in Cuba they already had. I can't remember the name of the school, Instrucción for the workers. What was the name of that? Do you remember?
La escuela de obreros.
It was a escuela, no, it was a escuela de obreros. I can't remember. It'll come to me. But it was a school that was established by Saturnino Martinez founded it.
Right.
And it was a school for the working classes.
Right.
And
there's also Bachillery Morales talks about escuelas de amigos y amigas,
yeah.
like in the countryside,
Yeah.
sort of thing.
Yeah. So it could be that was a model.
Yeah.
The other part is just a need, a need to affirm identity, and recognizing that or believing that Cuba's going to be a free nation soon, and they wanted their children to go back as Cubans. Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we've all heard of, more Catholic than the Pope or Mapapita que Papa. I mean, in exile communities, you have this phenomenon where people adhere to and even preserve a lot of what they left behind, even while what they left behind is evolving.
Right.
In the case of having this fervor, that's why I call that La Patria que nace de lejos. In this case, there was a war in Cuba, there was a movement in Cuba, but this was a collective experience. And what I was trying to say the other day was that the Cubans on this side of the Florida Straits had an enormous impact on the final result. And on the final idea of Cuba.
Yeah, because there's also things that at that moment you could, certainly maybe within the rebel, Mambises, they could say things maybe in that context, but otherwise you couldn't, go around Havana openly saying the same things that you could say,
So it really was, I mean, it wasn't like they just went here to support them. They not only supported them with finances and soldiers, but with ideology, and Martí was very much impacted by what he learned on this side of the streets.
Right.
And what he experienced.
I remember my dissertation advisor back years ago when I was doing this first research, and I finished writing it, and he says, okay, so that's fine and dandy what you've done here, but so did it cause revolution in Cuba?
Oh my.
Is this what caused revolution in Cuba? And I said, well, I don't know. I'm not clear. But as I've gone on, I see that this community did have a lot of impact in Cuba in different ways. Whether it was the absolute cause for the revolution or something else.
Well, I mean, this is also part of the problem with Benedict Anderson in Latin America is that, Benedict Anderson, of course, assigns a certain kind of importance, like primacy to Latin America within his story. But then you have people like Claudio Lomnitz who says, they're like Anderson's understandings of Latin America are limited, right? And it goes back to Alexander von Humboldt's observation. You would think that the printing press would precede these revolutions of independence, when in fact it seems to go, in many cases, goes the other way around.
Yes.
And there certainly are kind of non-print circuits of nationalism that are precisely because they're non-print, they're harder to document, and you have to think of different ways to.
The oral tradition.
Yeah.
And I think just to add to that there's a feedback that's happening if the editors are also lectores, right? So they're getting feedback from the workers of what is pleasing them the most here, and then they're going to return back and say they want more of this, even if that feedback is just in the form of cries or hitting the knife against the table. So it's kind of like it's impossible to tell who's creating this image.
And this is circulating. She just found documentation, which I didn't mention the other day, but when daughters were reading in the factory, women and other people were standing outside the windows and listening. And there's this thing here where it says that the strippers, like a female, a stripper would, or women in general, who were not necessarily lectores or even cigar makers, would hear that, and then everyone would go home and share this at home, and it was done in a serialized fashion, like when they read the novels. It was done in a serialized fashion, so everybody would go home, and this is what happened today in, Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, whatever, and, it just circulated everywhere. So, like you're saying, it's impossible to say, if it really started here, it started there, or whether the outside then feeds into the inside. It's really a circulation, of information and passion.
I just wanted to add to a comment on my fellow colleague, the question from Puerto Rico. And yes, it may have faded in Tampa, but not in New York. As it the Patria, which is from José Martí, the main goal was the independence, not only of Cuba, but of Puerto Rico. So it did continue all the way until the 1892s.
Martí, in some ways, resurrects that.
Yes.
But there's a pause in that. There's a sort of, it was during the wars that this comes up. But in between, there's not a whole lot of,
it's the dance's existence and that we have to improve.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Yes.
So, from everything you've said, I'm assuming that most of the Cubans who immigrated to Cuba at the beginning were set on not only Cuban independence, but on returning once Cuba was independent, right? And so, did some of those folks go back after the war was won? And then you also mentioned disillusionment with then what was happening after Cuba became independent. Did some of them return to Florida?
Yes.
I'll come back at the end to some of that, but the short answer is that some did go, most didn't, and many who went back ended up coming back to Florida because there was no work. There was no work. The tobacco workers especially, it was a very competitive trade. And when they went over there, they had to compete with other Cubans who were there, and especially Spaniards who remained in Cuba. And this was one of the great grievances that Cubans had, is that when Americans took over in Cuba, they simply proceeded with the Spaniards as usual, And as a matter of fact, many of the American entrepreneurs preferred Spaniards to the Cubans because they were less rebellious. Right? And so there is this grievance that continues. And so many of them just come back. Although there is a community, and there's a barrio de Calle Hueso in Havana, which I thought one day I might be able to go and do some work on that. But by all accounts, that was a barrio that all the Cubans from Key West went to. And they became known as the barrio de Calle Hueso, that's the official name. So there's some that went and stayed. Okay. Is everybody all right? Do we need a break?
Yes.
Oh, we do?
I think we're pressed for time, Jerry. I think we need to
You want us to
chug
continue?
along.
Just
Yeah.
because there's 6 chapters, and we're only on number 3. And so we should just press forward.
We have like 45 minutes.
I mean, feel free to get up and go to the bathroom if you need to, but.
Leave questions for lunch. Questions for the last.
All right.
For lunch, just
All right.
for lunch.
Okay, so revolutionary strategy. So we've got a community. We know what the community is up to, but how do you do it? How do you actually get it done? And so we begin with the establishment of a tradition. And the tradition is that all of those revolutionary leaders during the 10 Years' War and after the 10 Years' War who were interested in continuing the fight would go to Key West. Because they knew that in Key West there was still this enthusiasm. They got the newspapers from Key West, they knew what was going on, and so they would go to Key West. During the 10 Years' War, you have all these very important figures of the 10 Years' War going to Key West to raise money, and Key West organizing it and providing money. And the first commander of the Cuban insurrectionary forces, Quesada, Julio Sanguilí, who was a rebel throughout the 19th century. Vice President of Cuba, the Cuban Republic, Francisco Aguilera, went to Key West raising money. Ernesto Garcia, one of the great generals of the wars throughout, went to Key West. And Elcio Prado was an interesting guy. He was the son of the Peruvian president who was involved. He was just taken by the war, but he was also interesting because he was able to get José Poyo appointed honorary consul of Peru in Key West. And that meant that Poyo could operate with a certain immunity as a consul. And Poyo was consul throughout this whole period. And so the Peruvian government was supportive of this whole event. Fundraising. Key West created a system of fundraising which was there all along. Community fundraising, door-to-door fundraising, fundraising through the political clubs, but most importantly, fundraising in the factories. They would we're going to talk about it a little bit. Maybe leave that for now because we'll come back to that. This is a receipt. And so they always had these receipts that they would give to people. And whether it was $1 or 50 cents or whatever it was, you get your receipt for providing money. After the 10 Years' War, there's pacification after 1880. And pacification gave rise to a deeper radicalization in Cuba. This newspaper, they created a club called the Club Nihilista de Calle Hueso, a nihilist club. But nihilist doesn't really say it because it wasn't nihilist at all. It was a club dedicated to revolution, radical revolution, and it's referred to as nihilist because nihilists were people that were thought of at that time as using radical means like dynamite. Well, the Cubans decided that they could use dynamite, this new weapon, and they began to advocate the use of dynamite. They began to send dynamite in crates to Cuba to cells in Cuba, and this is all documented in the consular reports. And so they got very radical, and there's no evidence that they actually were able to use a lot of this dynamite throughout Cuba, but they were advocating this. And they were actually, these clubs were also in New York and other places. They called it scientific warfare. And this was one of the newspapers that came out in support. Nobody signed it. Of course. Guerrilla war. They could no longer get the country arms, so they resorted to guerrilla war. And two of the important guerrilla fighters was Carlos Agüero and Leocadio Bonachea, who both went to Key West. They were operating in Cuba. They went to Key West, raised funds in Key West, went to New York. In New York, they were rejected because New York was out of this game for the time being. And so they both ended up going to Cuba to try to set up revolutionary cells, both of them eventually were killed. But they got their moral and their financial support out of Key West. When that didn't work, they turned to the invasion strategy. The idea was to invade Cuba, but to invade Cuba, you needed these sort of premier revolutionary actors, and that's Martin Gomez and Antonio Maceo. Key West was constantly asking them to join and to take leadership of this new movement. Iriara was very important in this. And eventually they agreed. They could see that there was great enthusiasm. They also had an offer of a lump sum of money from New York, which never came to be. But so they relied almost exclusively on Key West, with some support from New Orleans and some of the Caribbean communities, to try to launch an invasion. They worked at it for about 3 years. Then Key West had a fire, and that was it. That was the end of that initiative. That they withdrew, and that invasion plan failed. That's the Key West fire. You can see that Key West, this is the area that burned. So it was a massive fire in Key West that destroyed almost all the factories, and that's what led to the movement of factories here originally to Ybor City. Surely what was left in Key West. And these are Navy personnel taking workers to ships that are leaving for Tampa or leaving for Cuba. So this was the moment in which Key West was at its lowest. This is at the moment when Key West, it looked like, was just going to, was not going to survive. The nationalist movement was not going to survive. But Key West starts another strategy. And the strategy was to raise funds. There's no funds to be raised in Key West, so they were going to raise funds in Cuba. And the way they were going to raise funds in Cuba was by using what I call patriot bandits. These are bandoleros who made their life simply ransoming people, kidnapping people. And what's interesting is there's a whole process of many of these bandoleros leaving Cuba because the authorities, this was such a big problem that the authorities declared an emergency. They sent the troops out to clear the countryside of these people. They went to Key West. They went to work in the factories, and they were politicized. The most famous case is the case of Manuel Garcia, a very well-known bandit in Cuba, goes to Key West, is recruited to be a leader of a guerrilla group. He goes back to Cuba and begins to kidnap planters and to ransom them and get the money and send it back to Key West to buy arms for the revolution. So here's Manuel Garcia becoming a patriot to some extent, but he was a bandit, let's face it. He did kind of both things. And Key West was, New York really rejected this absolutely rejected this strategy. And Key West was was condemned for this kind of work. Not that everybody in Key West was involved in it, but it's a very interesting term at a moment when Key West has no money. And so they have to find a new way to raise funds, and this is what came up. In the meantime, they're establishing revolutionary cells in different places in Cuba. Finally, you have the establishment of a revolutionary club which formalizes this idea of establishing revolutionary cells in Cuba. It's called the Convención Cubana. Virtually all the leaders in Key West were members of it, were unified. It had a secret organization with lots of other arms, and it was known publicly as Club Yucayana. This club was very instrumental in creating revolutionary cells in Santiago de Cuba and Holguín, in different places, and actually had already planned an insurrection for August 1892, even before Martí arrived. Martí actually told them to call her off because it was premature. Well, so this convención is very, very important in sort of reactivating the revolutionary movement in Key West after the fire. We'll move on. Preserving the revolutionary community. The fire in Key West was one problem, but labor became another problem. Traditionally, there was a very close relationship between Cuban nationalism and Cuban labor. Labor organizing, the nationalists supported Cuban labor organizing. The labor unions supported Cuban nationalism. But eventually you get a tension going on between the nationalist manufacturers and the Cuban workers. And the Cuban workers begin to argue that the manufacturers are using the revolutionary movement for their own purposes. And so it creates a separation between these two for a period of time. This is when labor organized a factory system using an apprenticeship program where they were in control of who actually worked in the factories. And because they controlled who worked in the factories, they could exclude anybody they wanted. You had to be an apprentice. The Cuban labor unions controlled the apprenticeship program, and the Cuban apprenticeship programs weren't letting in any Spaniards. They didn't want the Spaniards in there, and they didn't want anybody who wasn't willing to support the movement financially. So every week they would support money for this. José Martí is given credit for the idea, but that is already long established before that. Martí resurrects it later on. Finally, in 1885, many of these Cuban labor people organize and become part of the Knights of Labor, because the Knights of Labor argue for the primacy of labor discussions over nationalism. And the workers were getting tired of the nationalist discourse because nothing was coming of it. They were giving their money and nothing was coming of it. So after a while, they tired of it and they began to turn their energy to labor organizing. And the Knights of Labor was the one organization that seemed to want to unite everybody around these labor issues. Here you have two very important folks who involved in that, Ramón Rivero and Martín Bruno Delgado. Both, these are their newspapers. One was the Daily Equator, El Ecuador, and this was El Pueblo. And these two guys opposed the nationalist leadership in Key West, arguing that everybody should be allowed in the factories and that politics and labor issues should be separated. Put politics in the political clubs and put labor organizing in the factories. And of course the nationalists couldn't accept that because their entire funding system was based in the factories. So this created a great tension and a great separation. Eventually, after the fire, the Cubans begin to move to Ybor City. This is when Poyo, José Luis Poyo, takes his newspaper El Yara to Ybor City. This is the first issue of El Yara in Ybor City. And he came to Ybor City to work in the board factory, but also to begin to try to create a nationalist movement to replace what he thought was a losing venture in Key West. So he came, but immediately he began to organize, and the unions opposed him. There was a great incident that I don't have time to get into, but eventually he and all of the Cuban nationalists were evicted from Ybor City, and they went back to Key West, where he then took Yada back to Key West. But that's a very interesting incident, and it defines the difference between Tampa and Key West. Key West was always nationalist, primarily. In the early years, Tampa was primarily labor. They were more interested in labor than they were interested in nationalism, until a little later on. Finally, you have the influence of Cuban anarchism. Anarchists arrived both in Tampa and Ybor City, and of course the anarchists were profoundly opposed to nationalism. And there's a great crisis in 1899, a great confrontation between nationalism and labor. One of the great leaders of that period was Carlos Bonino, who had a newspaper called La Tribuna del Trabajo, which nobody's ever found a copy of. And here, Grecci, Corbett, all these people, these two particularly, ended up in Tampa. And those are the strike newspapers that they founded in 1889. In the end, the strikers win, the anarchists win the strike, but lose the battle, because after the strike was settled, then all the workers went back to nationalism in a very complicated way. And then these people all eventually leave Key West. Ramon Rivero establishes Revista La Florida, which is a labor newspaper in Tampa, along with Grecci, Francisco Segura, and many others who were at the heart of the labor movement in Key West. They give up the idea that they could defeat nationalism as defined by the local leadership, and move to Tampa. Okay. So, I've described this community, its traditions, and I remember that when I first, my first book that I wrote on Key West, it was in the conventional, style of understanding Key West from the perspective of those who first wrote about José Martí. And I'll come back to that. And my research has sort of led me to some different conclusions about this. But before we get to that, have you covered are you all familiar with Martí arriving in Key West at all? He comes to Tampa, and then he's invited to go to Key West. He had a very successful fundraising here, and he goes to Key West. He was invited by workers. That's the famous photograph of the invitation committee. And they were most of them were tobacco workers. And
Sir,
yeah, a new generation.
if you go back a moment to that picture, the back row, the last man with the mustache on the right, a very important stenographer who came from Key West, specially contracted, and he's the guy that spends 2 days in El Liceo Cubano taking down all of Martí's speeches, which Ramon Rivero published and sent on the ferry to Key West, and it was read in all the factories. The back row also, the fourth man in the back, also with a mustache, is the famous Pompith that got elected to the House of Representatives in Tallahassee, then comes to West Tampa, gets elected clerk, and it's his son that's now in baseball's Hall of Fame. Thank you.
Sure. And this fellow you mentioned on the right, he's Gonzalez, José Martí. So he was the actor that I referenced earlier. So Martí comes to Key West. He goes to the factories. He's received with great acclaim. He goes through the community, has all kinds of meetings in different places. And by the time he's finished in Key West, he has really created an enthusiasm that had been lacking since the Key West days of the Key West fire. And sort of put the whole labor thing on the back burner and raised up nationalism again, right? So that was his important role, was to get the workers back in support of nationalism and to start funding again, start funding the revolution. At that point, Key West leaders don't have to rely anymore on the sort of patriot bandits in Cuba, but they can now start raising money again as they had in the past, before that. They create, during that visit, Martí writes the final charter for the Cuban Revolutionary Party, which had been started in Tampa the year before. And two things about that charter is that it was, on one hand, a document that offered a sort of a democratic procedure for the party, but at the same time, it was highly centralized organization designed for immediate revolution. That is, it sort of put together the two interests, the interests of Key West and the interest of Martí, who was interested in a platform and an ideological position that the revolution hadn't spent a whole lot of time thinking about. They were just, the Key West group said, we'll go to Cuba, we'll have a revolution, then we'll see what happens. And Martí's going, no, we better find out what we're going to do first, right? So these two interests come together in the Cuban Revolutionary Party. Oh, by the way, that's the, that building is where the party resided in the West, and you can see the little emblem there. Yes?
I'm assuming that's a written charter.
Excuse me?
A written charter?
Oh, yes.
What's the length of it?
It's a long charter.
It's detailed.
It's multiple pages.
It's available on our reading list for
Yeah.
for anthropology.
Yeah, it's a fairly significant piece of work. It gets me to what I refer to as the Peláez and Figueredo debates. After Martí was killed in Cuba, there's this controversy that emerges in a revista, a newspaper called La Revista de Calle Hueso. And Peláez, and everybody was thinking about, this is the first time people are kind of thinking, well, what did this mean that Martí came to Cuba? And so the young worker Peláez was among those in the photograph. He was one of the young people who invited. He idolized Martí. He thought Martí had really saved the revolution, right? And so he argued that Martí arrived in Key West, and through his person, he took a community that was doing nothing, and brought it to a new place, and started the revolution. So Peláez was willing to give Martí the benefit of the entire thing. Fernando Figueredo didn't like that approach. Fernando Figueredo had been in Key West for many years. He knew what had been happening before that. So he wrote in response. He said that Key West had long before been a revolutionary community, and that all of the traditions that led to Martí's success in Key West were already there, had been there for a long time. And whether it's ideology, or whether it's organizing the factories, whether it was enthusiasm of the workers, whatever it was, that had been long established. And what Martí was able to bring was a leadership style, a charisma, and a political genius to work with all kinds of things. The one thing that the Cubans in Key West could never do effectively was to unite everybody. And Martí brought that talent, that skill. He brought a leadership skill that was able to take all these things that already existed and bring it together. So after, so I started my research kind of, this is before I knew about this debate, thinking the way Pelaez thought about things. And that's the kind of the conventional wisdom. If you see the historiography of Martí, this is when it gets to Key West, and this is really the discourse. But as I went further along and as I did this sort of long-term story, you begin to see that Figueroa's argument makes a lot of sense. Right? So it's not a matter of putting one above the other, it's saying it all comes together, and it's all a process, right? Which of course is more reasonable. We know how we make heroes out of people, and they sort of take on everything, and which is not always realistic. So to get at it, you really have to understand all the various economic, social, political forces at work. And I think that this Key West story kind of shows that. And finally, just a couple reflections on Cuban nationalism and U.S. imperialism. One of the great ironies of, let me do this first. After Martí dies, and the war is getting going, Key West now focuses its energies on getting expeditions together and raising money and sending arms. That's its goal. Raising money. They had the factories still organized. And as a matter of fact, the first major expedition that goes into Cuba comes out of Key West, and it's the one led by Carlos Roloff and Serafín Sanchez, which sparks the revolution in central Cuba. Cuba had already started in Oriente, but the central part was very calm. They sent this expedition and immediately allowed Gómez and Maciel to begin to move across the island. With these two commanders, Roloff and Sanchez. This is one of the expeditions out of Florida. And this is what the army looked like initially. So what they needed were guns. In fact, in Key West, they told people, don't go fight in Cuba. Go work in the factories. Cuba, we've got tons of people willing to fight. What they need are guns. What they need are weapons. But there's also a political, ideological struggle that goes on. Poyo's notion of radical nationalism is not in line with Tomás Estrada Palma's. He's the director of the Revolutionary Party in New York after Martí's dead. He's a very conservative man, and he is not one who is particularly enamored of Cuba as an independent nation. He was an annexationist, and later on, he is the leader of the Platist, he was the first president of Cuba and was a supporter of the Platt Amendment. He was not, but it's the people, the Plattist folks are the ones who took control of Cuba when they went back. Ironically, Poyo never, and the Key West leadership never challenged Estrada Palma, because as Martí had said, we can't get into these fights. We have to be united. And if we're not united, we're not going to get anywhere. This is what had happened during the 10 Years' War. There was too much division. So Poyo sort of accepted Estrada Palma's leadership, and eventually Estrada Palma becomes president. This is a picture of Poyo here on the left, Estrada Palma, and González Lanusa, who was, and this is when Estrada Palma was head of the party, and González is the secretary of the party, and Poyo was the head of the Key West party. And this picture was taken when they were here the day the Maine exploded in Havana.
Here where?
in Key West.
In Key West.
So that kind of set the stage for U.S. occupation.
And Dolores Poyo is your grandfather or your great-grandfather?
2 grades.
What?
2 grades.
2 grades.
DNA has been washed out.
I don't know, I see a resemblance.
He used to make a mustache.
It's the mustache.
I look in the mirror every day.
Doctor, the last one that you had there, Tomás Estrada Palma was a Cuban, but he became an American citizen. In reading the caption there, when the Maine exploded, that pleased Estrada Palma. He wanted American intervention. Is that? I never knew that.
Yes.
Yeah, he and the New York leadership didn't think that Cuba would ever get independence on its own. They didn't think that they could win. And on top of that, they didn't want Cuba to win on its own because the Revolutionary Army in Cuba was like 70% black. And they were very suspicious of the Revolutionary Party in Cuba. And they were suspicious of what might come after, and were fearful of what might come after. They always talked about the sort of fear that you'd have a Haiti, right? So Estrada Palma, he was very conservative, and so what he wanted was a sort of, he wanted annexation. He knew Cubans didn't want annexation, so he didn't push it. But he did believe that you had to have some kind of mediated independence. He and the Revolutionary Party of New York believed that pretty much. While the party in Key West opposed it, but nevertheless had no way of offering an alternative. New York had all of the power.
New York had what?
The power. Estrada Palma was the official representative of the Cuban government, of the Cuban revolutionary government in the United States.
Now I understand in 1906 why he tells Washington these Cubans can't run their country, come on in, and we again become an occupational force. So down deep inside, he really wanted annexation rather than independence.
Yeah. He wanted either annexation or some kind of controlled
Commonwealth or
something like that.
Yeah.
Something close.
I'll be damned.
And then, so in the end, then you have the U.S. occupation and the establishment of Cuba under the arrangement of the Platt Amendment, which meant that the United States could intervene in Cuba at its discretion at any time. And it raises an interesting question about the role of Key West, the role of the exile communities in general, in terms of facilitating U.S. imperialism. This is the great irony. So you have these very radical nationalists in Key West, and causing all kinds of trouble in Cuba, and ultimately helping organize the revolution. And this was only going to work if the Cubans could win their independence on their own. And they ultimately are unable to do that. Partially because the United States did everything in its power to stop the expeditions full of arms of getting to Cuba. They didn't want the Cubans to be successful on their own. And this set up eventually the conflict with Spain, and set up the occupation, the U.S. declaration of war after the explosion of the Maine. And so the question becomes, what role did these exile communities have in facilitating the U.S. occupation? Right? Of course, that wasn't, at least in Key West, that wasn't the idea. The idea was that they were going to be able to win this war against Spain. And in the end, they couldn't. They couldn't win the war. As hard as they tried, because they didn't have it. As hard as the workers gave their money, there was not enough money to get the kinds of armaments that they needed. And on top of that, the arms that they raised were often confiscated by U.S. authorities.
I think Spain was already tired.
Yes.
When 1898 came, they just didn't have nor the funds nor the means to continue the battle with growing America.
No, they couldn't.
But maybe if America didn't intervene, it would take a little while. But I think Cuba would have made it, because the persistence was there, the ideology was there.
Well, eventually, actually, you're going to have a speaker here, Professor Tome.
Yes.
Very interesting. He wrote a very, very interesting book that goes against sort of the conventional wisdom of what Cuban historians have always said, which is that if the United States had not, that the U.S. occupation came because the Cubans were on the verge of winning.
Yes.
But the Cubans really weren't on the verge of winning, according to Tone. According to Tone, as a matter of fact, when the U.S. occupation came, the momentum was with the Spanish. And Maceo was dead, and Gomez was being pushed back and being pushed back.
He was dead.
Who?
Martí.
And Martí was dead, yeah. So, so he argues that the reason the U.S. ultimately occupied Cuba is because the U.S. thought that there was going to be no end to this, right? It was a stalemate, right? But it is true, I think, that if the U.S. had not intervened, eventually the Spaniards would have tired, because they would have given up. Cubans would have given up. It would have been a stalemate. It might have gone on for another couple of years, but ultimately probably would have been independent. The United States had its own agenda in all this, as you would expect.
Since early on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, when you say what role did the exile communities have in the demise of their own, I mean, it really is only factions of it, because obviously there were people there in power in New York and perhaps elsewhere who were really wolves in sheep's clothing. They were always annexationists. They probably maybe wanted Cuba to be a southern slave state or 3 slave states. So it's not the community. You have to kind of distinguish between, I would say they were probably a minority, but they had control of the money and they were in New York.
Yeah, I mean, it was the community wasn't obviously thinking that way. They were just doing what they were going to do.
Exactly.
But just as a, but pulling back and looking how complex history is, right?
So that community is very...
Sort of, and the reason this came up one time is because the great annexationist José Antonio Rodriguez in New York, who was an annexationist.
Yes.
He says, isn't it ironic that Martí's movement put Cuba in the lap of the United States? And there was something to be said for that, right? That if it had been successful, of course, that would have been a different story. But, yes.
Jerry, we've got a pretty good understanding of the exile community, U.S. interests. Spain was a dying empire. They must have known that, their empire in the New World was going to come to a complete end at some point. What was their strategy moving over? Did they have certain preferences over others? Would they have preferred annexation by the U.S. rather than independence?
Out of spite. Out of spite, probably. One of the things that's curious about the Spanish with Cuba and Puerto Rico, for that matter, is that it almost became an issue of honor. An issue of honor. This was their last stand. They were not going to give it up without a fight, right? Because there were all kinds of compromises the Spaniards could have made, and the Cubans would have accepted them. Throughout, there was always a very strong autonomous movement in Cuba. People who viewed themselves as Spaniards, who wanted to be Spaniards, and wanted to be part of Spain, but the Spaniards wouldn't allow them any kind of self-governance. So it's a very curious kind of attitude that the Spanish developed. And it was both the liberal Spaniards and the conservative Spaniards.
That's a historical Spanish.
Yeah.
It's the old Spanish owner.
Yeah.
That is above everything else.
Right.
So that's,
But the other piece is you also had Spanish interests in Cuba, who were probably very influential in getting Spaniards in Spain to think about that, because the Spaniards in Cuba had an investment in the way things were. Right? They controlled everything. They were in charge of everything. So they didn't want elections. They didn't want an opening, if you will. So it's a complex story that I haven't fully engaged, but it's very interesting.
Because I'm studying the newspapers, I've read the newspapers in Spain in 1897, 98, and I think as newspapers as an instrument of war, and what Spain was saying is, we are winning. Yeah, we are winning, we are fine, we have the money, we have the means. So they did not consider that this intervention would make them lose. So 1898 is called in Spain the disaster year, and it's because they did not see it come. They were blindsided. So newspapers continue to talk about we have to win by honor because these are our islands, and they do not deserve these islands. There was a lot of honor involved, and newspapers did not contribute positively to Spain because they were talking about a win. But it was not.
Exactly.
What she says is very true, except that the Spanish Navy at the highest level of the Armada had recently read a monumental bestseller written by the American Admiral Mahan, M-A-H-A-N. Very significant. The Spanish Armada at the highest level said, we don't have the ships that can confront the armament and the big cannons that Admiral Mahan has advocated, and in Santiago de Cuba, after the U.S. has intervened, Cervera tells his men, we're going to go out, vístanse con el mejor uniforme. You're going into a death trap. They're waiting for you there with their big cannons. Dress up with your best uniform and go out forward like a Spaniard with honor.
To do anything else would be to lose. Like even if you win without honor, it would still be a loss.
Yes.
Yeah.
Losing with honor.
So what is your take on the name? And was it an accident or was it, it's a sabotage?
No, it's been clearly documented that it was an accident. The boiler blew up.
And other models of that ship had already had this problem.
Yeah. Yeah, it blew up, and then it was used.
Well, hers.
It was used by the press and by the U.S. government as justification. So they went through this sort of pro forma
investigation
process.
I'm a journalist, I'm skeptical, and I read that report, and that's part of the
Okay. And it's also interesting that I found a really interesting report
Examples of whether the same ships exploded.
published. I saw an interesting report published on Yada that argued that there was a Cuban who had blown up the ship, who was paid by the Spanish government to do this, and so I don't think too many people believed it, but you can see that even the nationalists by this time were trying to create friction. At this point, everybody pretty much understood that the United States was going in.
You could look at the caricature of in the newspapers at the time, how the vision of Cuba, the defenseless woman began to, change, was being attacked by the villain Spain, and then right after they get into the war, then all of a sudden everyone is a pickaninny, and it's all there.
Yeah. Yes.
Professor, would you comment about the Teller Amendment and how that impacted on the Americans having to get out of Cuba, but not really wanting to get out of Cuba?
Well, the Teller Amendment was an amendment that was passed after the Maine and after the United States had decided to go into Cuba. The committee in New York, the Cuban Exile Committee in New York, asked the United States for some assurances that the U.S. occupation would result in Cuban independence. There was this fear that once the United States landed, who was going to get them out? And so the Teller Amendment was passed very quickly before the invasion to assure them. But as Yada and other newspapers at the time noted, that the Teller Amendment said nothing about recognizing the Cuban government in arms.
Yeah.
But there was a government in Cuba, and there was an army in Cuba, and that neither of these were recognized by the United States. So the idea would be that if once the United States went in, they didn't have to recognize any Cuban authorities. They would just go in and establish an occupation government, and that's what happened. Then there was no need to even make reference to any kind of Cuban leadership. The Cubans were kind of pushing for recognition of the government at first, but eventually the army's dismantled, and the Cuban government is dismantled, and the occupation is there. So what that meant is that the United States could leave when it wanted. There was no deadline. And so the United States' idea was it would leave when a responsible and appropriate government was in place, as they referenced it. Right? And so they organize elections. They get Estrada Palma elected. The United States wanted Estrada Palma elected. And so he became the president. But that wasn't enough. They also wanted the Platt Amendment in the Cuban Constitution, and they wanted Guantanamo Bay for American base in order to be sure that they could control the Caribbean, right? In addition to Cuba. So the United States was very much, was not very interested in maintaining direct control of Cuba, but they did want guarantees that their interests would be safeguarded. And this is the way they did it with the Teller Amendment first, and then with the Platt Amendment. Yes.
I read that actually the negotiation was that they would abandon military occupation of Cuba in exchange for the Platt Amendment being added to the Constitution, so they would get, the naval base.
Yeah,
and the absolute control that they wanted.
That's right. In other words,
so that was a sort of the quid pro quo negotiation.
The Cubans wrote their constitution, and then they gave the constitution to the governor. The governor reviewed it, sent it to Congress. Congress said, all right, this is fine, but you're going to have to attach to the Constitution the Platt Amendment with these specifications, if you will. And the Guantanamo, and they also wanted Isla de Pinos, but Estrada Palma was able to sort of get them to back off on that. Yes.
I know we have to go, but given QS fierce revolutionary spirit and the presence of all those newspapers, do you know if in the 20th century continuing press of critique came out of QS about the U.S.'s control of Cuba? Was this still happening in QS?
After
1900?
No, because all these newspaper editors go back to Cuba. And there are no more newspapers.
And the clubs are disbanded.
And the clubs are disbanded. And what I refer to, the way I think about this is that Key West after 1899 moves from being an exile community to an immigrant community. So that all of a sudden the whole Cuban issue is now done. And now they're going to think about their local local issues, local problems. And when they find out, when all of these Cubans end up not going back to Cuba because of a variety of things, no jobs, etc., then they just sort of begin to think of themselves more and more as Cuban Americans. And eventually they move north, and they don't send their children to school in Cuba, they send their kids going wherever. So this is a big transformation moment. That's not to say that the Cubans weren't still nationalist in their sentiments, but they just weren't activists in the same way.
Yeah, I'd just like to point out the irony, I find it really interesting to study the machinations that occurred after the death of Martí, and what the real motivations were behind the different players, and how when Estrada Palma becomes president, the immigration policies of the new Cuban government are to bring in as many Spanish workers as they can, and essentially one is to whiten Cuba, and two is also to get rid of the agitating Cubans. So
and a lot of the administrative positions went to the former Spanish soldiers.
Right, absolutely right. So these Cubans that had fought so hard for this independent Cuba eventually actually go back, have to come back here because the jobs are being given to Spanish immigrants coming back to Cuba.
Well, my great-grandfather was born and raised in Key West, and he was a tobacco worker in the Gato factory, and had been a tobacco worker for many years. And when he went back to Cuba in 1899, he couldn't find a job in a cigar factory because the cigar factories were full of Spaniards and, of course, Cubans who were already there. So there was not a lot of opportunity for these exiled cigar workers to go back. And so most of them stayed. He became a baseball player, and he became finally got a job working in the Havana city government.
I have a question about the thing about who blew up the Maine. And going back to this idea that someone suggested that the Spanish hired someone, I would assume the Spanish would not want American intervention. So the idea of hiring someone to blow up the Maine is like saying, come on, U.S., come get me. That to me doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
It would have made no sense for them to provoke the United States.
I'm in Rico.
It could have been blown up by someone who was